Hello and how's it going? Welcome to the channel, and I am here for a top 10 list video for you guys. For this list video, I'll be going over 10 of the most underrated albums by popular bands. Now, I think I chose some pretty solid albums for this list here, and keep in mind I'm not going to be having anything from Metallica on this list, of course, since, well, there's not really anything from Metallica that you could say is underrated. I mean, I think all their albums are fairly recognizable, I think. Same with bands like Slipknot, Pantera to an extent. So yeah, you're not going to get like those levels of popularity on this list. Like bands where most, if not all, their material is recognized, of course. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into this list once again. I think I have a pretty solid list here. No particular order either, so let's go ahead and begin. So first up, we got Reroute to Remain by In Flames. And I definitely think that this is In Flames' most underrated album. Now, I know a lot of people don't like this album. I think a lot of people say that like this is when In Flames really dropped off. For me, actually, the album where they dropped off would have been the album to come after this, which was Soundtrack to Your Escape. I actually think this album is really solid. And if you had to make me choose the most underrated In Flames album, I have to go with Reroute to Remain. I think that, in my opinion, this was their last solid album. Now, sure, they've had some decent stuff to come after, but the thing is, that's really all that I can give the other stuff, is just like a decent rating. While with this album, I think for the most part, it's pretty solid. Like, this was like really the last solid In Flames album. It's got many great songs on here, like the title track, which is maybe one of my favorite In Flames songs. I don't know. You also got some fan favorites like Trigger and Cloud Connected. Those are some really great songs. You also got songs like Minus, which is, I think, one of their most underrated songs. Yeah, very great album. Some experimentation with this album too, such as in songs like Metaphor. It's a different sounding song, but I do like it. But yeah, Reroute to Remain by In Flames. For the most part, I'd say it's underrated, and I don't understand the hate for it. If you're an In Flames fan, haven't checked out that album yet, definitely check it out. Or if you're someone who didn't like it at first listen, please give it another chance. That's all I gotta say, especially compared to the stuff that we've been getting lately from that band. So next up, we got Minutes to Midnight by Linkin Park. Yeah, when it comes to the most underrated Linkin Park album, in my opinion, it's always went to Minutes to Midnight. This album kind of always had a special place for me, since this was like the first album of theirs that I've like heard in full. So it does have like a sense of nostalgia with it as well. This is maybe my second favorite Linkin Park album. My first would have been Meteora, but Minutes to Midnight is probably my second favorite. Yes, I probably like it more than Hybrid Theory. I don't care what anyone says about that, but I don't know. I really dig this album. It's very underrated. I think a lot of people don't like this album because of the approach they went with it. It's not as new metal as the first couple of albums. Like, they took a more lighter approach, even though this album still has some of that aggression in it, such as in songs like Give It Up, Bleed It Out, and No More Sorrow, which are some of the heaviest, most energetic tracks on the album. I've heard some people say that Linkin Park took a sort of Coldplay approach with this album. I can understand that, especially with songs in the second half, but there's even songs in the second half I don't mind. I mean, some favorites of mine off this album would be Given Up, Leave Out All the Rest, What I've Done. I think In Pieces is also really good, but yeah. Linkin Park with their album Minutes to Midnight, definitely underrated. Definitely doesn't get enough recognition that it deserves, in my opinion. It's a really good album. Next up, we got Saturate by Breaking Benjamin. And there's no other way around it. This is definitely Breaking Benjamin's most underrated album. I know there's a lot of fans that say that this is their weakest album. And I think for obvious reasons, it's not as, radio friendly, or, it's too raw compared to the stuff that they came out with after, because their newer stuff is definitely more, easier to digest if you're, just now stepping into that hard rock, heavier style of music kind of territory, I guess. But I don't know. I really dig this album. This is definitely in my top three favorite Breaking Benjamin albums. Probably my third favorite, just behind Phobia and Dear Agony. But yeah, Saturate. It's a great album. If you're into any kind of hard rock or grunge music, definitely give this album a listen. You might like it. There's a lot of great songs on here like Wish I May, Medicate, Polyamorous, Natural Life, Water, and Home. And yeah, this definitely has some of Breaking Benjamin's most underrated songs on it. And for the most part, it just is an underrated album in general. But yeah, Saturate by Breaking Benjamin, really good album. Next up, we got Presence by Led Zeppelin. Definitely the album that I think of first when, if someone were to ask me what I think is the most underrated Led Zeppelin album, it's got to go to this album. I mean, I know some people might say In Through the Outdoor, which is also a good album and also kind of underrated, but I don't know. I got to go with this album as, the most underrated because this album just doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. And it also has one of the best Led Zeppelin songs of all time on it, Achilles' Last Stand. I mean, if you haven't heard this song yet, what are you doing? Check out that song. You won't be disappointed. It's like a near masterpiece. It's pretty lengthy, but man, is it good. But yeah, Achilles' Last Stand is the opening track, and it's one of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs. You got other great songs on here, like Nobody's Fault But Mine and T for One. T for One is actually, I think, one of their most underrated songs, and I don't know, for the most part, this album is just really underrated. There's not like a whole lot of appreciation shown to this album. Sure, it's not their best work, but I still think it's a really good album for what it is. So, Led Zeppelin with their album Presence. Next, we got Power Windows by Rush. Now, this one is a bit of a tough call, and you could make the argument that this album is underrated, because I know there's some people, when it comes to their Rush rankings and stuff, have this in like the second, like the bottom half of their ranking, which I don't understand at all. This album is actually really solid. There's not a weak point on this album. Really, the only weak point on this album would have to be the song Middletown Dreams, but even that song is still pretty decent. So there's not really a weak point on this album. So yeah, if you had to make me pick out some favorites though, I mean, The Big Money, Grand Designs, Manhattan Projects, Marathon, pretty much the first four tracks. Territories is also really good as well. But yeah, very solid album. Maybe their most 80s sounding album. Either this album or Hold Your Fire is their most 80s sounding. Although you can make an argument that Signals is also their most 80s sounding. It's just really debatable. What's also debatable is picking the most underrated Rush album. But I don't know. Because Rush has several albums that I would consider underrated, but I think at the end of the day, I gotta give it to Power Windows, because this album, it's just one of those albums that like has little to no flaws and doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. It's definitely a great album. If you're into, any kind of rock music that uses like synths and, anything of that nature, you're gonna really like this album. And this is definitely one of Rush's more atmospheric albums, and it went off really well. So yeah, Rush with their album Power Windows. Just a great album in general. Next up, we got Drama with their, we got Yes with their album Drama. So yeah, definitely a great album and definitely underrated as well. Now, when it comes to, people mentioning the band Yes, they are mostly, talking about albums like Fragile or Close to the Edge. And while I would agree that's some of their best work, you still can't deny the greatness of their most underrated material, like the album Drama. But yeah, definitely a great album for sure. Got many great songs, especially Machine Messiah and Tempest Fugit. I mean, these are just some really, really great songs, and songs that, you just can't go wrong with, and some of my favorites on the album, of course. So yeah, Drama by Yes. Definitely a great album. If you're into any kind of progressive rock, check out the album. And if you're into any kind of progressive music in general, please check out this album. Next up, we got Black Clouds and Silver Linings by Dream Theater. Now, you could make the argument on whether or not this album is underrated, but I don't know. I would say it is underrated. This album definitely doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. Sure, it's not one of their best, but I still think it's a really good album, especially with songs like A Nightmare to Remember and Wither. I mean, these are some really good songs, but yeah, not much to say about this album, but if you're a Dream Theater fan, haven't checked out this album yet, definitely check it out. And if you're someone who is a Dream Theater fan and wasn't crazy about this album at first listen, please give it another chance. You might like it. But yeah, Black Clouds and Silver Linings by Dream Theater. It's a really good album. Again, not one of their best works, but still really good. So definitely check it out. Next up, we got Fear of the Dark by Iron Maiden. Once again, you could make a debate on whether or not this album is underrated. I think some people would have maybe the X Factor on here, or maybe Dance of Death. Now, Iron Maiden does have their, I guess, fair share of underrated albums, but I don't know. I gotta go with Fear of the Dark for this one. This one is definitely underrated for sure. There's just a lot to like about this album, and easily the best of their 90s work, I think. This was, of course, the last album with Bruce before his little break from Iron Maiden, of course. But yeah, it's a really great album. Is it one of Maiden's best? No, but I still think it's a really good album. You got many great songs on here, like Be Quick or Be Dead, From Here to Eternity, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, Wasting Love, and the title track, of course. The title track is, of course, probably one of their best songs, but yeah, definitely a great album. Can't go wrong with it. Very dark and moody sounding album at times. But yeah, definitely a great album. If you're a Maiden fan, wasn't crazy about it at first, please give it another chance. I think it's a really good album, and it's, like I said, I think it's the best of Maiden's 90s work. So Iron Maiden with their album Fear of the Dark, really good album for sure. So next up, we got Dehumanizer by Black Sabbath. Solid album for sure. I think there's some people that pass this album up either because, this is, an album that, came later on, or, it came after the 70s work, or, they're just not crazy about Dio with Black Sabbath. But sure, I would agree that Ozzy is a better vocalist for Black Sabbath, but I still really like Dio, though. I think his stuff with Black Sabbath is still really good. This album is without exception. I mean, this album has a lot of great songs on it, like Computer God, TV Crimes, Letters from Earth, and Time Machine. These are some really great songs, but yeah, not one of Black Sabbath's best by any means, but still a really good album. So Black Sabbath with their album Dehumanizer. If you haven't checked out this album yet, definitely give it a chance and give it a listen. If you're a Black Sabbath fan, check it out if you haven't already. Last but not least, we got The System Has Failed by Megadeth, which is probably one of the more controversial albums on my list, because some people might say Euthanasia is their most underrated, or Cryptic Writings is their most underrated, but I don't know. I really dig this album. This album, I think, is more underrated than those albums, I think, because those albums I just mentioned do still get, their fair share of recognition and attention at times. But The System Has Failed, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a really great album for sure. Probably the best of their 2000s time, I think. Got many great songs on here, like Blackmail the Universe, Die Dead Enough, The Scorpion, Back in the Day, Of Mice and Men, and yeah, definitely a lot of great stuff on this album. If you haven't checked out this album in a while, definitely give it another listen. If you're a Megadeth fan, wasn't crazy about it at first, definitely give it another listen. And at the time, because I believe this came out in the early 2000s, I think this was like their best album in a while at the time. Because before this, you had albums like Risk and The World Needs a Hero, which are iffier albums. But this album was definitely, you know, their best in a while at that point. You know, probably their best since maybe Euthanasia or something. I don't know. But yeah, underrated album. Definitely doesn't get enough attention. So Megadeth with their album The System Has Failed. Well, there you go, guys. That is a list of albums that I think are underrated by popular bands, of course. Let me know what you guys think. What are some albums that you would personally have on your list? So let me know your thoughts in the comments. So thank you for watching and have a nice day.